Saddam Hussein did any good. What, we asked, will life be like in Iraq after Saddam? Will it be better or worse? And here, a clear majority of Americans believe life will be better, and so do most people in 6 other countries, including Britain. But there are others who almost sound as if they wouldn't care if Saddam came back to power. 4 countries, 4, had majorities believing that life is now worse or no different in Iraq: Jordan, Russia, Indonesia, and France. Well, let's hear views about the world's only superpower from our international broadcast partners again. And first, to an ex-member of the Superpower Club, and Vladimir Posner in Moscow.
Well, I think the first thing you have to keep in mind is that for a long time, 2 generations in fact, Russians saw America as being their #1 enemy. And that tainted the views of many people, and it's still pretty much around in this country. And the fact that this poll shows that Russians are rather balanced in the way they judge America is, I think, quite an interesting phenomenon. But to get to the Iraqi issue, most Russians, about 30%, say that Iraqis will not live any different from the way they lived before Saddam Hussein fell. A smaller number, 23%, do say that they'll live better, and only 20% say they'll live worse. So Russians are kind of saying probably not much is going to change here. And that's interesting when you consider the fact that over 80% of all Russians were totally against the war. That doesn't color their judgment in this particular field. It is true that most Russians say that America lives by the motto, might means right, does throw its weight around, and therefore is dangerous. And what's interesting is, in this question about which is more dangerous, the United States or Russia, the fact that all countries, except of course Israel and the United States, said America. It's interesting to look at why they said that. Some people think that it's perhaps because Russia has faded away as a superpower, but I don't think that's true, because North Korea and Syria and Iran never were superpowers, and yet they're seen as being more dangerous. I think it has to do with the fact that Russia today is no longer a threat. It's a much more, if you will, transparent country. It is not trying to foist its ideology on the rest of the world. It is not seen as a military power trying to take over any other country. And I think that's a very, very important change. So I would say that this poll will be an eye-opener to many Russians when they see it. And back to you in London.
Vladimir, thank you very much. We're now next to South Korea. Neighbors of one of the members of George Bush's axis of evil, North Korea, and it's over to Young Lee in Seoul.
Hi, Peter. We have a question here. Do you think the life for the Iraq people will be better following the fall of Saddam Hussein? More than half of the Korean respondents said yes. Despite the growing anti-U.S. sentiment here in Seoul, we South Koreans seem to think that the U.S. can play a more effective role than the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein in the development of Iraq. And as for the question whether America's attack on Iraq was justifiable, significant number of Koreans said they disapproved the invasion. To the next question, between the U.S. and North Korea, which do you think is a greater danger to the world peace and stability? 48% of the respondents answered America is a greater danger, compared to 39% who believed North Korea to be a greater threat. I myself feel this result is amazing, given the fact that traditionally North Korea has shown much greater aggression toward us than the U.S. has. So you may wonder why anti-U.S. sentiment is spreading so rapidly among Koreans. To understand that, you need to pay attention to the tragic incident which occurred here last June. 2 young middle school girls were killed by a U.S. armed vehicle during military training exercise near the DMZ. The 2 U.S. soldiers driving the vehicle were acquitted of a murder charge and quickly sent back to the U.S. Many Koreans were outraged at the unjust decision and poured in the street chanting, "No U.S. forces here." This incident was led to famous candlelight vigils and accelerated anti-U.S. sentiment in South Korea here. Back to London.
Thank you, Young. A fascinating light there on one of the most extraordinary findings in our poll. Thank you very much for explaining it so well. Now, details of how Americans themselves see their role as an unrivaled military power. We can cross back to Gary Langer, ABC News polling director in New York. Gary.
Well, you know, Peter, in terms of public opinion, security issues are ultimately personal, particularly in the post-9/11 era. Among the precious rights and liberties perceived by Americans is the right to security, the right not to get randomly murdered by terrorists on your way to work in the morning. I think it's best if we understand public views of U.S. military might in that lens, once again in this post-9/11 era. It's really not about revenge or retaliation or retribution, which are essentially juvenile impulses. It's about something more significant, which is self-protection, security, self-defense. That's how most Americans view the projection of U.S. military power as we've seen it recently in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Given the desire for security, it is natural for most Americans to want the United States to have essentially a free hand and unfettered ability to act internationally, if necessary, to protect American citizens. It's equally natural and rational for majorities in other countries who perhaps feel less threatened to prefer that the U.S. be constrained by international consensus before it acts. That's the debate and the dispute we saw very clearly over Iraq and continue to see, and that, of course, is the issue we see laid out very clearly in this polling data.
It's clearly a natural impulse, Bob Kagan, but of course America is in a completely different position, probably than any country has ever been, just in terms of how far ahead America is in military spending. America is now beyond catching up for any of our lifetimes, isn't it?
Well, and it's not just the dollar figures, it's what the money's spent on. There's been this tremendous technological revolution going on in military affairs, and the United States is just very, very far ahead in that regard, which, I mean, quite frankly, means it's easier for the United States to wield power without losing casualties. It's also possible to conduct a war without causing as many casualties on the other side. But this is the reality. I have to say that there's some interesting elements of this poll, though. The South Koreans claim to be worried about the United States, and yet when asked, are American forces useful for their stability and peace in their region, they say yes. And I think there's a pattern and perhaps a paradox, whether when people feel that they are threatened, when Europeans want something done in the Balkans, they call on the United States. When they don't feel threatened, when they have no need for American power, they're resentful of American power. And this may just be the reality that we all have to deal with now.
And a certain hypocrisy there as well. Jack Lang, in terms of the scale of American power, I'm very struck. Forget the smart missiles and the missiles coming with PhDs, which we'll see next. When it comes to something simple, like the aircraft, the C-17s, that get an army from one part of the world to another these days, Americans have got something like 150 plus of them. Europe has got 4. We are so far behind, we have no hope in Europe of matching American power. Isn't that the reality?
Yes, you describe the facts. And it's very dangerous for the security of the world, because with the concept of preemptive war, when one country is the military master of the world, it's very dangerous. And it's the reason why we have to build a European army. You know that the French government and the British government has begun 2 years ago in Saint-Malo, and the first steps has been accomplished, but we have to continue with great will. But something very important also is to invest in intelligence, in research, scientific research. And from this point of view, we have to imitate the United States. They are able to invest the double of public and private money in scientific research. And when you see, for instance, the European budget, the credits for culture, education, research, peanuts.
They're quite small.
It's a great problem.
I mean, there are people, of course, around the world who would say the last thing we want is the Europeans out there with another army, given their history. But there are other parts of the world where it might have made a difference. Saib, what sort of difference do you think, for instance, it would have made to the Middle East, or might still make to the Middle East, if Europe had the same kind, or at least a parallel sort of power to America's power in the region?
You were. At one point you were, as the United States.
Not
and you occupied us. We were the colonizers. And I believe today we have a new Rome that came back for the only time in international relations.
Bigger than the old Rome.
Yes, but I'm talking about the issue to us in the Arab world. With 22 Arab countries, the GNP of the whole Arab countries is 10% of that of the United States. So nobody is seeking to fill the gap or to compete militarily. But I have been living under Israeli occupation for the last 36 years of my life. I was 12 years old when the occupation came to my town, Jericho, and the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem. And then Iraq occupied Kuwait. In 3 months' time, the Americans went to war using all their military might to liberate Kuwait from the occupation. It's once again the double standards.
But why should one country, however powerful, be expected to solve everybody's problems?
No, but the thing is, I'm a people with no army, no navy, no air force, no economy. And the Israelis are fighting me and maintaining their occupation and building the settlements with American tanks, American planes, American weapons, American money. And honest to God, the question here, I realize what Fareed said about, seeking the United States in order to produce a fair and just solution. Because as long as the double standards and the treatment, we have all recognized Israel's right to exist. So the problem today is not with Israel, it's with Israel's occupation. And if the United States does not see how to end this Israeli occupation that's financed and backed and tolerated by the United States, I don't think you can win over any extremist phenomena. And I think this will be the source of all threats to come in the future.
Fine. Fareed, there is an old saying that to a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Do you think that the issue is not simply the scale of America's military power, but what's not alongside it?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are two problems with the way in which the American administration is using its power. One is, I think, there is a tendency to be willing to destabilize the world militarily without then putting into place instruments of stabilization. What I mean is the American army is very good at winning wars. It's not very good at nation building. And we are not investing in capabilities to nation build. We are not asking the Europeans or other nations to come in and help us nation build in the way we should, in my opinion, in a place like Iraq, which is going to require vast resources, a long occupation. So I think we need to, if we do want to, and I support a lot of the assertive measures against nasty regimes, but if you're going to do that kind of thing, you also have to be willing to pick up the pieces and to make a place like Iraq a much better place than it was. The second point